episode of Menu Combat. And I'm your host, TheWolvesDen, and there are three parts to Menu Combat. What am I grinding on? What am I reflecting on? And what is the Bard's Tale of the Week? And let's get into what I've been grinding on. I've been grinding on the original grind game, Dragon Quest 1. And so I am playing the Switch port, which is the port of the mobile port. And you might be wondering, why am I doing such a thing? There are really two reasons why I'm doing this. One of the games I'm most excited for this year is Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D. I cannot wait. In fact, I originally skipped Octopath, or was thinking about skipping Octopath until the praise, strictly because I just didn't want another HD 2D game until Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D. And so I want to prepare for this. So, spoilers for a technically 30-year-old game. Dragon Quest 1, 2, 3 is technically a trilogy. Dragon Quest 1, which is the one I'm playing on Switch, is the first game everyone's played. And then the second game comes out a year later, and it follows up on the events from the first in some way or form. I don't know how long is the distance. But what makes 3 special in the culture, at least as I've heard over the time, is that 3 plays out to be a prequel that sets up 1. And so I've been excited to play Dragon Quest 1 to kind of ingratiate myself in Alphalgard, that's the name of the place, and get to know some of the things that people are saying. So when I tell you I'm playing Dragon Quest 1, I'm trying to take it seriously. I'm trying to think about location names. I'm trying to think about what are people telling me about the Erdrick. Erdrick is the hero of the third game. And so I'm paying attention to everything they say about Erdrick so I can imagine what am I going to, what are some of the events that will have to happen in Dragon Quest 3 to set up the events in Dragon Quest 1. And when I think about that, I'm really thinking about some of the stuff with the sages. And so in this game, so Dragon Quest 1 is really the quote-unquote progenitor of the entire JRPG genre for people who don't know. Came out in 1986. Final Fantasy doesn't come out until next year in 87, months after Dragon Quest 2. That's kind of the setup, and the story is that Dragon Quest 1, Yuji Ori, Sugiyama, and Akira Toriyama as a triad created, especially trying to pull from Ultima. I think it's Ultima 4 is the one they talk about. So that's kind of the backstory. I'm assuming anyone who's listening to this knows Dragon Quest, but I feel like I just need to say it. And more so just to kind of set the context for how I went into this game. And so they tell me certain things like, oh, there are 3 main magic elements, components that the Prince Erdrick gets. And so I learn about the Staff of Rain, or I learn about the Sunstone. And when you speak to each of the sages guarding these items, they'd be like, oh, I remember when Erdrick gave this to me. They've really making it, especially the Sunstone guy, not so much a Staff of Rain person, but the Sunstone person makes a clear of like, man, I remember when Erdrick gave to me, and he's so tired of waiting for who you are as the hero of the game to take up Erdrick's moment. So you even see Erdrick's grave. So when you open the game, you open in Castle Tangtel, and in Castle Tangtel, literally you're in the king's room, and he's telling you some small details about like, well, you should go to the next town over. Brecony, I've just been calling it Tactile. Note right now, anytime I use a name for a town or a location, I'm going back and forth with different translations because my brain does not remember where I've learned these names originally. And so I really want us to think about like, what does it mean to play like the quote-unquote first JRPG? And the answer is, you're gonna get lost. So let's consider this. I open the game in Castle Tangtel, and I open it up. You meet the king. He tells you about his daughter lost. You go over to the next town because that's where you buy your first club. You buy your armor. And the interesting thing about the setup, the conceit, and you can begin to see some really thoughtful approaches to game design here by Yuji Ori. It's your literal castle. You go to the town literally next to it. It's like you can't even get into a battle because of how close those are. But the other thing that you see is where the Dragon Lord is in terms of an island close visually. Literally, when we talk about a game that's trying to set you up to know what the goal is, because the goal is defeat the Dragon Lord, you visually see that from the minute you get out. And we give a lot of props to games now for being very clear and explicit about the goal and setting you up with an intention. And to see that Dragon Quest was really able to do that from the get-go, it's beautiful. I mean, the reason why I say this is important, think about a lot of props that we go back to something like Breath of the Wild about setting up the defeat Ganon from the get-go. You know what your goal is and so forth. Remind you that game, you could do it from the beginning. So it's not, the NES game obviously isn't that open, but I really want us to think about the implication that literally from the get-go, you know where the ending is. And so that's charting you on display. So you go over to town, you buy your first few things, and I tell you, this game is a grind. See, I knew it was a grind going in, but sometimes I've asked myself multiple times while playing this well, dang, how did my JRPG ancestor brethren go through this experience? So again, I mentioned I'm playing the Switch port mainly because through the Switch port, it has inherited specifically a lot of ease of use. So when they introduced the command system, it's so archaic originally. In the NES version, you literally had to go into your command menu in order to take the stairs or in order to pick up an item that you saw lying on the floor. Obviously now they have a more general button to do these things. But that's just to really give you an idea of how vintage this is. So you go in over there, you buy those items, and you're grinding because you can't get far. See, you open up the map and there are about 12 blinking locations. And they don't, Tangtel tells you to, does anyone in Tangtel tell you where to go? I don't really think so. I think the most interesting thing is that you go into that town, one town talks about, like, please don't tell the king that we lost a daughter or anything of that nature. So we were rescuing the king's daughter, Princess Gwaelin. And it's cool to learn all these things. And I think the thing that was most intimidating about playing this game is that the only place you could officially hard save the game is at the king's castle. And I felt like that was going to be hell. And it still kind of is. But when you think about the design setup of this game, you kind of have to walk back and be like, no, that's still some good game design. Even though it's a little bit archaic, a little bit outdated, you can kind of see the finesse that Ori is going for. So the way that this map is set up is that there are different bodies of land connected by tiny bridges. And so the thing that first town tells you is that each bridge is a gauging moment to let you know, hey, the next area is going to have a lot of hard enemies. And think about it. You naturally know this when you play RPGs as you go into different places, you get harder enemies. But there's literally a visual signpost through the emphasis of bridges that you're mentally collecting, like, okay, where's a safe place I can grind? Only where I am. And so you're able to gauge how strong you are by how much more willing you are to explore and go across these bridges to different locations. It becomes one of those things where, oh, I'm measuring my progress by my location. And it really feeds well into the amount of exploration that this game has. So how do I even communicate this? When you start, you go to that town, and you're just stuck in that first continent trying to grind it out to make sure you can continue to go on. And because there's so few places and people aren't telling you explicitly where to go, it is very much okay, all right, I see this place on the map, I should go here. And we talk and gather information. So it is really a basic RPG in the sense of they're not giving you a lot of information. You're really going to have to pay attention, take notes, figure it out, piece together the locations. And it's charming, right? It works. I think for me, there's a little too much openness, but it also might be that I'm a little bit too much of a new school person. And what do I mean by that? So here's a great example of both that gives a lot of props back to the game design, but also highlights some of the issues I had in experiencing this. So on the very first part of your continent, you have like 4 main locations that are like really accessible to you. I mentioned the castle, I mentioned the core town. There's another town called Gallenhorn. Gallenhorn, you go there and it's kind of out of the way, and they tell you about the legend of Galen himself. He formed this town, he's a bard, he's particularly important, but they don't really give you anything else. And you're like, okay, I got it. Special guy. And you're like, okay, so that clearly knocks that town. That doesn't give you any sense of progress. Let me book it to the next location, and that's on the first pass of the bridge. You go past your first bridge, and you're going to cold. Now, you getting bodied the minute you get to cold because it's so much more higher enemies. I had grinded to level 5 from 1, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm ready to get to cold. The enemies are like level 7. Like, you gonna get bodied. So you have a grinding. The minute you cross that bridge, you gotta put in the work. And so I'm putting in the work. I go to Cole, and a couple of interesting things. You learn about Claire. Claire's husband is lost, and there's like he went through the caves. I can't find him. AKA, there's a cave to go find to figure out where the next place to progress is. And you're trying to piece together, what do I do here? You find the fairy flute, you find things. So it's all these things where you're like, okay, you talk to people, you piece together information. And the thing that stood out while I bring up Cole is that Cole tells you about this place called Caitlin. They tell you, like, you gotta go to Caitlin, right? Caitlin is where you're gonna use this flute that we give you. And the setup for me was that, that means not far from what my next sense of progress is what I'm going to do. But there's not much places else to go on this continent. So you go through the cave. There's a cave that's surrounded by a poisonous swamp. You go through, and I finally book it to Rimaladour. And Rimaladour is open to one of my favorite moments in this game. See, you walk around Rimaladour, and they tell you about, there's this guy who sells magic keys. And I think magic keys are such a very interesting conceit for this game. And you can notice that I'm thinking Chrono Trigger plays around with things that you can't open yet until much later. I hadn't noticed in a couple of the towns I mentioned before, but there are like places that are locked, places that are inaccessible. I hadn't given it a lot of thought, but to access them, you need magic keys. So you're in this town, there's like, there's a merchant who sells them. I bet you can find it. And I go looking for this guy. And what's cool is that it's the first town that has a person on the outskirts. So you walk into a normal town, you see an inn, you see a armory, you might see a guy selling medicine, and that's usually what you see. I mean, there may be a congregating place or not. This is the first place where outside the core town, on the periphery, you see an NPC, you're like, let me go talk to her. And then you're like, why would they let you go outside the boundary? Why is this a thing? And so I was like, I'm going to skirt around. Because the reason why I'm mentioning skirting around is that if you go too far off, they'll throw you back into the world map as if you're exiting. And so you have to hug the screen and go around. And then that's how I found the merchant who's selling the magic keys. And then it became this thing of like, okay, I found these magic keys. I'm going to buy them. I now have to book it all the way back to all of these places. So I have to go back to Cole. I have to go back to the castle, the Tangatel. I have to go back to Galenhorn. And to find new ways to progress forth. And that felt so organic. And I felt like, I had figured out the secret by just talking to people and being the way that it plays NPC was a guiding tool. And I was like, dang, this is great. But I don't know where to go next. That was one of the challenging parts at that point, where it felt like, okay, I was doing process of elimination. But now it felt like, okay, so what's progress look like? And one of the things that stood out of progress is going to be hard to find in this game is how I was unable to use the technique of Rimaladour consistently. See, I mentioned there are about only 3 places to go with the magic keys, but also the thing that they tell you is that you learned how to navigate a town and find its secrets. It's one of the things that unconsciously you've learned from Rimaladour, and I was prepared to say, I should apply that to different places. So I go back to Castle, and you can hug around the castle to find a secret place to find one of the legendary items. I felt dumb, but I didn't think of that. See, once I got the magic keys, I went around in town opening things. I found a priest. I found a new guy selling magic keys, but I didn't think to find the secret basement. See, that if you spoke to all the people in Tangle Town, they'll tell you where the basement is, that it's south. But because when you go to the priest, there's a little bridge and they're like, don't go yet, you gonna get bodied. That's really what it is. If you cross this little bridge inside the castle, you gonna get killed. And so I was like, I'm not powerful enough yet. Only to find out when I looked at a walkthrough, it's like, no, do the same Rimaladour technique to go around and find this thing. And I was like, you know what? I should have learned the lesson and used the same thinking technique. But this is what I say the forebearers were thinking differently than I was. See, now I was like, okay, I figured out. That's my bad. My bad, game. You taught me something and I didn't internalize it. I'm going to take it when I go to Galenhorn. See, people have been talking about in Gallifrey, there's a secret grave, there's a secret something. And one of the things that stood out, my brain made the same connections back as I did in Rimmeladar. I was like, okay, maybe there's this weird pathway that goes nowhere. There's an entire bottom open space by a bridge. I bet you if I just like hug around this thing, I'm going to find the cave. The answer is no, it is not there. And I was like, man, why did you teach me this technique and it couldn't apply here? And I opened these magic keys to open all the different things, and I find a place. And it's like, and they were telling me about the cave. It's like, hey, man, you don't want to go in that cave. They're trying to really dissuade you from going to Gallon's cave, kind of building it up to be like a special moment. Bro. And I was like, man, I feel dumb. I can't figure it out. When I searched online to figure out where Gallon's cave was, I was like, how in the world? How did my gaming JRPG ancestors figure this out without a manual? See, I knew one thing going into this game. Especially in the West, the most infamous thing about this game is the NES strategy guide that was packaged with Nintendo Power. And I took a look at it. There's a bunch of stuff I'll bring up later. It don't bring this up, which means that any of my older brethren in JRPGs figured this out without the power of Nintendo Power of strategy guides. How? Because when I tell you it's hidden as in you have to go back to the place where I open the magic keys in the town, and you have to hug inside of a building to find a singular exit to find the cave, and there's no hint, there's nobody saying anything. It is I felt so dumb. And I was very much one of those cases like, this is a different era. This is just... you can blame the Castle Tangtel on me. That's on me. This is on the game. So, I'm enjoying it. As you can tell, I'm thinking about the design of how it communicates navigation, piecing pieces together, and thinking it out loud. It has some of the traditional issues of old RPGs, limited inventory space, and I think I do want to mention one major thing about the port. It's kind of garish. I felt like it was over exaggerated. See, I heard all these things about it looks ugly, and look, on the mobile phones it could make sense, and it's not so much ugly in the traditional sense. See, I want us to get this clear. I do not dislike the painterly backgrounds for the enemies or the painterly approach enemies. It does clash, but it is too beautiful to look at the green dragon or too beautiful to look at the gold golem. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, the pixels will be hot, but this is good enough. I like this. It's luscious to look at. What's garish is just like the screen and navigating on the screen. It's just like, it's blown up in a way that it's like, this just doesn't fit this. But the one benefit I do want to give it credit for about the art style is that it's true to the Akira Toriyama designs. One of the things that I think we take for granted is how in alignment certain games can be visually later when they're revisited. And the reason why I bring that up is I mentioned last week's episode I played Final Fantasy V. I love it. And I love literally having back here. I love Amano's designs. There's nothing in Final Fantasy V that matches these designs. I've looked up the designs for Final Fantasy V characters. They do not match the sprites. Not even just like, oh, they're different. The color schemes, everything. There's a clash between them. It's fine, right? Like the job system does great work for the pixels, and it's fine. I like it, but there's no connection between the art and the visuals, really. But when you look at what the NES was trying to do, and then you look at Akira Toriyama art, those are not one and the same. And when you look at specifically the overhead sprites that they designed for this mobile port, you can't. What are we arguing, man? It looks like the Toriyama art. It looks like the Dragon Quest Toriyama art, box art. So those are some things. Other interesting things to think about with this game is, as I mentioned, is the role of the king's save point being so weird. So as I said, you can only hard save by the king. And I mentioned that every place that you go is a sense of progress in terms of the higher enemies and going across bridges. And so what ends up happening is that imagine I'm going to a particular location. At that location, I am terrified of dying and losing XP. And also, this is the game that taught me that, you're also going to lose half your money. And I'm like, dang, this is going to be a chore to regrind, to either build up back the money or whatever. And then starting over at the map, you kind of have to do the whole long trek. It's just, oh man, this is terrible. But what I realized is that specifically because you do so much backtracking in this game anyways, they took backtracking into design of this penalization. See, if you're able to get out of a battle and you have minimal XP and you're like, okay, let me book it back because I got this item or I got this level, let me book it all the way back. The very first part of your journey is going to be difficult. You're like, all right, I need to flee, I need to cast my magic, I need to do that. But the minute you go back to a place where there was a bridge or you go through a cave and you're on the other side, you're like, oh, these enemies ain't bothering me, because it's only the enemies in the current location where you're grinding to get the most XP or the most money that's really difficult. So once you've been able to go past the previous point, when you go back to the previous point, I'm like, oh, I can bop through these guys. I could go through these ghosts. Okay, I can go through the Drakis. And it's consistently like that. And so the beginning part of your return journey is a pain. But the rest of the return journey is fine. It's painless. And so this game is able to give you a sense of growth really through this backtracking. And that's the other thing. This game, in the level growths, you only got 20. And so each level means something, both in terms of magic you're learning, but just like you gain a lot of strength, you gain a lot of HP, and it feels like level 11 feels different than level 10. It really does. Compared to other games, sometimes you're like, well, it's marginally. No, this is a marked difference in what you can do. And so when I think about the design about backtracking to the king, while it's still a nuisance in terms of travel and you don't want to face all the slimes on the way back, it's mostly frivolous the minute you get past the current place you're in. And I think that's just a great way, especially because of how you're navigating the map. I kind of know what's coming next and not, but I'm even thinking for people who are really in the exploring space, once they figured out where they need to be, the rest of the journey was fine. And so I say that to say archaic design in the sense of like the king is a hard save. And mind you, this game does have a quick save and you can do that. But I tried to stay a little bit closer to the king save time to time, not all the time. And I was like, oh no, there's a design ethos here. There's some way for you to feel better as a player through this design choice that I'm not happy about. And so we got to give a lot of props there. It's been a fun experience. This game is I love Dragon Quest V. 5 is one of my favorite games of all time. I really enjoyed 11. I was a little bit let down of it, but I think 11's great. And so I've always wanted to go further into Dragon Quest, particularly because I appreciate its whimsy and its charm and its earnestness. I think that's a phrase I want to apply to Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is earnest. It is sincere. I've had people call it basic, but I think basic is a derisive verb or a description. See, I think about Dragon Quest the way I think of DJ Premier. DJ Premier is hip-hop without the frills and accoutrements. And that doesn't mean basic. It's just when you take the idea of a concept and distill it down into its brass points, I think of a DJ Premier beat where it's not saying that he's pulling the musicality of other folks, right? It is, obviously he does that, he's a sample, but the way that he treated the sample machine, it really feels like he created a sound that is truly unique to its own, and it's like an ethos. That's what I think of Dragon Quest. It is. But the thing that I think that people get at with Dragon Quest is that a lot of other games have a little bit something else going on. I think when you think of Final Fantasy, there's elegance and prestige, or you think of Pokemon, there is a connection as animals, or you think of Shin Megami Tensei, you think about the hard edges, or you think about Persona, where it's like the relationships you're building. And so sometimes people look at Dragon Quest as like, so what does it really do? What is it really? And it's homey. It's earnest, it's sincere in the best ways possible. But I do think that for many folks, that earnestness doesn't warm them. That homeliness feels like a knock. The way that some people are not ashamed of home. Ashamed is not the phrase, but people just take home for granted, right? Like if you speak to somebody and say, hey, I've lived in this place for such and such years, and that's the only place I've been. I think there's some beauty in that. There's an intimacy in that knowing. But some people be like, well, you're not really learned. Please understand the air quotes I'm applying here. And so I think Dragon Quest falls into that quagmire. And I think when you play other games that are equally, quote unquote, basic in terms of location or placing, and realize it doesn't carry the whimsy, it doesn't carry the charm, or it doesn't carry the heart or the earnestness, You're like, no, this has it. It's distilled. But that's just my vibes of Dragon Quest. For those who, as I mentioned, I have the Staff of Rain, I have the Sunstone and Tangatel. I've finished Rimala Daur in terms of traveling there. That's just letting you guys know where I am in the game. So what have I been reflecting on? This is a topic I've been excited, like one of the things I've been so amped to talk about. I want us to think about what series can be enhanced, or what can we get from certain series turning into JRPGs. See, both Mario and Mega Man have turned into RPGs and made RPGs that people really cherish. I actually haven't gone to play much of them except for a bit of Command Mission. But I'm talking about the Battle Network series people revere, and I haven't played either the Paper Marios or Super Mario RPG or Mario and Luigi. But obviously we know these are games that in particular have added to the lore. I've gotten access to more lore through this experience, different type of storytelling, and just different mechanical enhancements that are able to lean into the best things about those games, right? There are elements of those games that are either enhanced or referenced or used to support RPG elements, be it Mario with timing, or the Robot Masters as great clever designs for the EXE designs in Battle Network. Or even just thinking about the different weapons for cards and that. Like, you can tell when you adapt a game into an RPG, you are trying to figure out, like, what are the mechanics that speak to that game, or the ideas from that game that can translate it into the RPG world. With all of that being said, I got a couple here that I've been thinking about, but I'll go with the one that I'm most amped for, the one that I'm like, this just has too much potential. Kirby. The reason why I say Kirby as a JRPG would be brilliant is that it might be a Blue Mage Fest. See, one of the things I think about with Kirby that allows you to do this is that Kirby has a great cast of characters to pick from. Like, if you wanted to place Kirby with Meta Knight or Adeline or Waddle Dee or DDD or any of the side characters that they've had, it would be wonderful. And so there's a story to be told through navigating Popstar or where else this game wants to take us. And that alone is exciting to think about from a story lore perspective. I always think about this, like the stereotype of JRPGs is that young boy kills rats for a local town, at the end kills God. Tell me that's not the Kirby thing where it's like fights Wispy Woods at the end of 1-1. Kills some eldritch abomination at the end. That's the JRPG essence. Kirby got it. But I'm thinking mechanical enhancements and values that Kirby can bring is that Kirby absorbs enemies. And I'm thinking, what if you could absorb different enemies and take certain elements from them and apply them to weapons that you could equip Kirby with, right? It's not weird to see Kirby with a sword or a hammer or whatever. And so imagine he could absorb individual enemies and change the properties of his actual weapons. That alone makes him a primary party blue mage. That there's mechanical value in that if you were to really design the game around that idea, you'd get something very fresh. But I was also thinking that there's some also other natural values. Think about about Adeline. Adeline could be a summoner or also a blue mage in a different way, because she summons Crackle. She summons who else does she summon? She summons like 3-4 different villains. Through sketching, she could be a perfect summoner. Or if you just have her face different boss battles and absorbs different elements to summon certain type of magic. Those are like, thinking about two of your parties are different types of blue mages that work in different ways, or a blue mage and a summoner. I'm like, there's mechanical things to explore by Kirby being a JRPG. And then the thing was like, oh, you could have DDD, and then you have Meta Knight, and you can trick them out in different ways and different weapons, and there's a lot of references that Kirby can make. Like, think about equipping animal buddies or summoning animal. Like, I think mechanically there's so much you can do that would feel fresh, even if it's to be a basic RPG in terms of introductory, to keep it in line with the Kirby ethos, that I think it's the primary example of a game that could be great as a JRPG. The next one is the one that gets me in trouble, but I'm going to say it. 2K. Now, I'm going to provide some context to walk you through this, especially for those who do not do sports games. I'm from Jamaica. We do sports games. Even if you're not even that deep into sports, just you're going to play sports games growing up, where I think in America that's not always the default. Anyways, point being, 2K is what I choose. And thinking about it, I played Dynasty mode since NBA Live 03, which is, for those who don't know, is that when you manage a team, manage its players, going over the course of a season or multiple seasons, you go through the draft, and the whole idea is that you're doing player recruitment. It's all party management. That's really what... The funny thing is that sometimes people say jocks aren't nerds. No, they are. They are one of us. It's weird to say it, but they do party management in these games, man. They just do. Anyways, and so that's the ethos that I'm thinking is like, we can tweak further. So let me explain to you the way that 2K works, and then let's try to play out of it. See, when you play a 2K game, part of it is about the fantasy of using a certain player. So you're using a player like LeBron or Jokic, and so the things that you think about is like, what are all the properties that make Bron, be it tendencies of shooting and whatever. And so in the middle of a game and controlling Bron, you want to feel like you're doing Bron-esque things actively, or Jokic things actively, and therefore you need high pass IQ, you need good smarts on defense, whatever it is. And so that's the fantasy that they're selling you. And their properties. So Jokic is a little bit slower. Bron has gone slower. Bron's athleticism is down. Jokic doesn't have a lot of... Again, I'm just using these players to kind of bring up this point. And so these characters have stats already. That's what I'm getting at here. And so I want to abstract the stats to a different place. Rather than abstract the stat for a fantasy around playing the player, what about abstracting the stats to be a fantasy around... I'm the coach. This is one of the things where, for me, one of my deep desires to improve my ability to understand the game and read the game and read plays in a way. And I think a turn-based 2K could speak to this. And so what I'm thinking about is that typically the games already take turns. Think about it. On one side of the court, one team has the ball, they're playing offense, and the other team is playing defense. And what I would think about is the fantasy of the coach is thinking about formations design. I'm thinking about what each character can do as a result of that. So typically when you're playing a game, you pass a different player, you'll do whatever you're doing. And I'm saying, let's abstract that all the way out to a player with a command system with, think about it, for my basketball people, you know that at any time a person catches the ball, it's a triple threat. You can attack, you can pass, or you can shoot. And thinking about the stats that are associated with that, you can turn that into a turn-based moment based on the stats that we give these people. And then you can have additional stat boosts based on the formations that you're designing as a coach. You can have additional stat boosts from crowds, additional stat boosts from things of that nature. And then thinking about a player makes a decision, then the defense is making a read. And so they're almost anticipating your choice and breaking that into a guessing game in a turn-based space. The player, and if that player has enough stats to match you, right, all the defensive stats that we're thinking about, to respond to you, then you have, okay, a player made a decision, defense makes a read, and really making events like it's all about what the coaches taught them to do. And so I'm thinking about defensive formation. So the offense gets into formation, pause on that turn, defense goes into a formation, but they can't necessarily see what each of us is doing directly. And what I'm thinking about, and this is where the basketball connection is really coming through, is that the decisions that happen that affect people being able to make shots. I'm thinking about what happened with the Nuggets and Lakers recently, when one of the ways that they were trying to stop Jokic, it didn't work, but they were trying. They originally had Anthony Davis on Nikola Jokic. For those who don't know, Anthony Davis is one of the best defensive players in the league, and they felt like, oh, that could handle Jokic one-on-one. That was not working. What they wanted to do is that to have Anthony Davis not on Jokic so he could roam in and out of the paint to adjust to whatever Jokic is doing in terms of passes, etc. So what they do is that they place Rui Hachimura on Jokic. And I'm thinking decisions like that being broken down into this turn-based thing, because I always think about these games do not reward coach level thinking consistently. And I think the fantasy that we talk about with players is being that player. But I'm like, I want to be Eric Spoelstra. I want to be Darvin Ham. And I think, imagine that in the game you have a player making a choice, the defense read, the player making a choice, defense read, does the shot go in or not? And then it resets on the other end where that is repeated back and forth. And that could be broken down into like 5 different parts of your turn-based thing. Maybe you add an active time-based element to represent the 24-second shot clock. This kind of thinking and approach and breaking down into this granular abstract component is why I think 2K, from a coach perspective, could be exciting. And I think it leans into what 2K has already been doing with all these stats already. You've already commodified all these things into this direct actions of playing sports, but we can recontextualize that to change the level of fantasy and thinking. That's my best way to break down my dream of 2K being a 2K being turn-based sports from a coaching perspective. And given our time, we'll only go through one more game that I think has a lot of value by being turned into RPG. Metroid. And it's weird for me to say Metroid because I think it's actually one of the worst typical, if you're like, okay, how does that work? Game is about isolation. You don't really talk for quests. You don't really do that. But it wasn't, I would have said the same thing if I didn't play Transistor. See, Transistor is just you and the sword talking to each other. You do some random environmental storytelling, but I also think about the roguelike elements with powers, and I'm thinking about how at every Metroid game you lose your powers and trying to turn that into a mechanic. Imagine every time you die, you end up being regenerated with 4 different powers. And so the only thing you might lose from Metroid is the traversal component in terms of how important those powers are traversal. But I think you could gain an interesting environmental storytelling experience through Samus using the fact that their powers are always rotating and changing, and that you have this weird system that is part action, part turn-based. See, you can pause, you can pause in Transistor, and in that moment you can pick from a range of moves that maximize out all your action points. I mean, it takes a long time for you to recharge, and so you can plan everything all the way through. Then you can just do everything in real time. And I've been thinking about like, if you keep both approaches, you can keep in some of the 2D elements in terms of the dexterity and feeling, and also give some of the RPG elements of like planning and decision making. And I'm thinking about developing certain skills would be a different addition to the Metroid component. Imagine boosting your screw attack to different stats and different properties. That's the other thing that Transistor highlight, is that you can get like modifiers for certain things. And I'm like, the Metroid world is built for that. Imagine you add a phazon thing to something, or if you add some elemental property from an enemy, or not just elemental properties, but different properties onto different machines. I think the suit is so built for a lot of what Transistor was doing. And I think an isometric point of view, the different types of combat options, and that you can keep it still action-based for people, and the environmental storytelling, I feel like from an RPG perspective, there's a lot there about what Metroid could be. Actually, I got one more, and this is just going to be done really quickly. Horizon! See, Horizon's already been trying to be very RPG light. But I'm thinking about what if Horizon were to take elements of Tales of, and that means imagine if you were able to keep your party members, right? So that's one of the things I think about Horizon. I've only played Summon Zero Dawn, but you meet Varl, you meet Silence, you meet the guy with the blonde, the red mohawk, you meet the king, and imagine if you could bring any of those guys along with you for this ride. And I'm thinking about the expansion of Aloy's tools to different types of weapons. And I'm almost thinking Monster Hunter-y, but not exactly. And what do I mean by that? I know that in the second game, in Forbidden West, that she gets more physical combat, but I'm like, what if you were to really take some of the electrical components, some of the ice components, some of all of these things, and be able to spread it out amongst different people, and therefore with different items, different staffs, swords, daggers, things of that nature, and then really embellish the differences in play style. So I think Aloy would be a all-round character, but what if you have somebody who's more of a tanker who can do certain things with a shield, and that changes how he responds to monster, or someone with who's just strictly speed and strictly can place traps in a different way that's not just the bow placing maps or throwing things on the floor, but maybe they use the camouflage better, or they can use it while moving very quickly, or things of that nature, where you're taking Aloy's toolset, spreading it to multiple people, and then making different people have different combat skills around it. And I'm more so, reason why I bring up Tales is to bring in skits. One of the things that I think that Horizon Zero Dawn was really trying to do is tell a complete, cohesive story. And I have complicated feelings about the storytelling, but I won't do that. I think one of the best things that people would agree is that her interactions, particularly with Silence, is just spectacular. But beyond just interaction with Silence, is that you would get a lot more of Aloy of interacting with people in non-traditional story elements, where it is about more of the journey, more about just like being a person. I think, especially in the first game, she's been isolated from people and has an issue with people, and it gives her a little abrasion, gives her a little character. But I was like, it would have been cool to see different dynamics kind of get to reveal her based on making this journey with other party characters. And I think you're giving her such a good cast that I think a party would really add to Aloy. So both from a combat perspective and expanding Horizon Zero Dawn, but from a story perspective, giving some more levity to moments. I think things of that nature, where you go into a town and they're just talking about drinking, or something that's just really basic and light. I think the Tales series is so excellent at providing light emotional moments that seep into your heart, in addition to a larger story. And I think Horizon could use some of that. So those are some of my ideas of series that could be enhanced by becoming JRPGs. And so what is the Bard's Tale? So I got 3 songs for you this week that I'm really excited to share, as again, these are songs I think would be like, JRPG Music Hall of Fame. And so firstly, it wasn't going to be long till I said it, a Kingdom Hearts song, Dearly Beloved by Yoko Shimomura. The phantom piano keys, so you have your main piano riff and you have these phantom keys in the background. It's just iconic at the start screen. I still haven't played Kingdom Hearts for myself yet, but growing up with my friend and his PS2, that song is so attached to watching him play. When I think of peace and tranquility evoked by JRPGs, I think of Dearly Beloved. And it's just this ethereal feeling that if you really listen to the background, there's like this I call it a misty sound, but it's like either these very light strings or very light voices that are just like really dulled in the background, and it gives it a fullness. Yoko Shimomura did God's work on that. Another song, Casually. This is off the Breath of Fire 3 soundtrack, done by Yoshino Aoki and Akari Kaida. And it's this elite phone music, right? Like, if you've been ever holding a phone for a bank or a college, it's that kind of wait, please hold music. But the piano pitches are really light. It's almost very xylophony. The strings kicking, and it's just so peaceful. Almost, I actually thought about it, it's like, feels like where Pokemon music was going. So Breath of Fire 3 is what, like early 2000s? But if I'm thinking about Sun and Moon, some of the places around Sun and Moon, or the remake of Alpha Sapphire, this is where it feels like, musically they might have poached a little bit from here. Beautiful, beautiful music. The last song is The Legend of Wind by Toshiya Takashi for the Legend of Xanadu game. And it's this US power metal intro. I mean, you have these rolling hi-hats, they're almost trap sounding hi-hats, and then when the drums kick in, the lead guitar kicks in, it's just like this 80s riff with a little light humming bass in the back. It's just jamming. And when the additional percussion comes in, it's like a light drum at the top, and then they switch the percussion. It's just rotating, and the minute that the crash comes in, you get these like evolving guitar sounds, and then this psychedelic piano at the ending. It's a great tune. And so when I talk about the Bard's Tale, as I mentioned, at the end of each episode, I am going to upload a playlist of these 3 songs. If there's a song that you think you want to recommend as potentially Hall of Fame worthy, ideally on Spotify. There'll be some episodes that just can't be done this way, but I'm at least leaning towards Spotify for now. But I appreciate you listening to this episode of Menu Combat. This was a blast. And if you have thoughts about Dragon Quest, you have thoughts about this, so forth. Last thing. I had a conversation about my previous episode with somebody, and I want to get at a comparison that they made to really wrap things up, because I want to highlight, is like, if you have some great comments, I want to bring them forward. He was talking about, the phrase that he used was that these games teach you the rules of engagement as it comes to storytelling. You know what to expect. He was using Yakuza as an example, where in Yakuza games, you have the storytelling moments, the cutscenes, where there's voice acting and so forth, but in-game cutscenes, or not in-game cutscenes, but in-game stories are not voiced. And so it trains the player to recognize these things. Versus that something like Zelda sometimes goes back and forth. It can be a little bit confusing, distracting for folks. But that emphasis on rules of engagement is so powerful. I think about the idea when we play RPGs, what are the rules of engagement? How are you being taught? What are this game is like communicating to you? And I think storytelling is very much of, we tell you that these are the rules of engagement so you can buy into the style of storytelling as it continues, so you can accept the silent protagonist, accept this thing, because we set up the rules to be consistent in this way. And he also talked about that for him, he's a cinema person. He describes that in transitioning from silent films to talkies, that there is something to be said about what was lost in that transition into tell different types of stories. There is an artifice being put on by having actors speak almost theatrical like performances, and you're losing almost like an essence of storytelling that was happening pre talkies. It's fascinating. He even talked about certain directors would silent directors would hire certain people off the street, trying to make it as authentically human as possible. These are wonderful considerations he provided to me as we think about just communicating ideas through these games. On that note, we call it a wrap. Press pause, take a break, relax, customize your party. Appreciate you so much. This is The Wolves Den. You can find me on Twitter at TheWolvesDen25, Instagram TheWolvesDen25, and then the Instagram for this for the podcast is at Menu Combat. The Twitter is at Menu Combat. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day for watching. Have a wonderful day.